So, Ben, you're based in Texas now, and many people now asking, how did we get to a point where police officers have been targeted? How surprised are you that we're at this point now?
The sad truth is that I'm not surprised, and this is, I think, has been the sad events we saw in Dallas a few days ago were in many ways very predictable. I think we have a situation now in the US which we could almost describe as being a low-grade form of civil war. We have such a militarisation of the police force, in part because of changes that have taken place since 1997 and especially since 2011, where the Department of Homeland Security have allowed local police authorities to basically have weapons-grade material in terms of MRAP vehicles, in terms of armaments that are normally reserved for the battlefield. So you've had the kind of militarisation of the police force in the US. On top of that, you've had the kind of the deep-seated issues of racial injustice and racial discrimination, which are now kind of bubbling to the surface. And I think it's kind of ironic in many ways that this is happening under Barack Obama's administration, which was supposed to be this kind of post-racial era. But in fact, I think what happened last week, and also the events before it, the deaths of two black men that kind of led to the protests around Black Lives Matter, and then that led to the shooting, was entirely predictable.
Charlie, a low-grade civil war, that's the phrase, Ben, that you used. Do you agree with this?
I think there's a major civil unrest, and I think there are definitely agitators and activists that are trying to create this, and they're doing a very good job of it through Black Lives Matter. There are good people, obviously, that are concerned about the police. They have a right to march. But don't forget, those police were there actually protecting the people that were marching to give them their right of free speech. And then, of course, when they were getting shot at, we're running in to protect their other officers and, of course, the crowd.
There have been a lot of comments about the Black Lives Matter campaign. I just want to get a quote, because, Lolo, I know you reacted to what Charlie was saying. President Obama, on Friday, after the Dallas shooting, said that when people say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean blue lives don't matter, blue lives being police officers. It means that all lives matter. And right now, the big concern is the fact that the data shows black folks are more vulnerable to these kind of incidents. But this isn't a matter of us comparing the value of lives.
No, this isn't at all. And I think, first of all, we have to be careful not to link the shooter with the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't think that there's any correlation or link between the two. The reality is that Black Lives Matter came about because black lives are seeming not to matter. So it doesn't mean nobody else's life matters or police lives don't matter. It means that the lives of black people matter. I mean, it's really that simple. And I think it's a shame if people take that and say it's some sort of agitating force. At the end of the day, these are people who are responding to events that are happening in their time, which they are not happy about, and that nobody else seems to be doing anything about.
Douglas, the Black Lives Matter campaign, is this a reaction simply because people actually think black lives don't matter?
Yes.
Is that the case? Black lives don't matter? Because that's how, obviously,
no, I don't think it's
feel.
the case. I mean, obviously, there have been a set of incidents in recent years in particular that have been very high profile, partly because incidents can be caught on camera now, and there's a huge and immediate sort of public, and apart from anything else, social media campaign that begins almost immediately after any incident. And since the Black Lives Matter campaign started, I mean, obviously, you know, it starts off, as President Obama said, it's meant to say, well, of course, all lives matter, but, you know, this is an equality issue. The problem is there have been, since the beginning, people on the fringes of the Black Lives Matter groups who have gone further than that. I mean, there was a protest, I think, in December 2014 in New York City, where some people were saying, you know, what do we want, dead cops, when do we want them now? Now, that obviously would be condemned by the vast majority of people involved in Black Lives Matter. The one thing I think is really important in this, though, is that there are now, on every imaginable side, on every imaginable issue, in America in particular, groups and spokespeople who come straight out after any incident and sort of politicize it and use it immediately and say, you know, this means that, or this means what, you know, this backs up my story. And I just think that, particularly at the moment in the US, people have to be very careful about doing that and to basically simmer things down, because after any incident, whether it's you know, waiting until we find out what the circumstances of somebody's arrest are before you start to, you know, claim it for any cause, or and at the same time also making sure that after the shooting of a policeman you don't use that. Everybody has to stop trying to politicize everything, to my mind, and wait for the facts.
The problem, the Ferguson effect, as it's being called, if you look what happened there, first off, they had already made up the narrative of the hands in the air, etc., It turned out that it was nothing like that. It was a justified shoot. You know, there was 100 FBI agents investigating this. And what happened, you had days of rioting, and who suffered? It was the black-owned businesses and the black employees who were, you know, burned out of their businesses. And these were people that were relying on the police because the police were protecting their children from gangs. And now the police are saying, I don't want to go into these neighborhoods. I may get shot. Or again, if I'm trying to get involved, I may come up on charges or have a riot working out. So it's ultimately hurting the black population, which I think is the sad thing about it.
The thing is that it is political, and it's political because we're not talking about events that have happened in the past 2 or 3 years. When people are looking, they're thinking about the entire lifespan of being black in America. They're thinking about their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their ancestors. So this to them isn't just a few black men that have been killed by police. They're talking about historical racial discrimination and prejudice and structural inequality, of which these killings are the epitome of that. So I think what you're seeing, the reaction that people have, is not just, OK, some black guys have been killed, which is in itself traumatizing and very upsetting. It's what does this represent about our country and its relationship to us, and them not feeling that they are basically cared for as Americans.
Let me bring in, from our London newsroom, Leroy Logan, who's the chair of the Black Police Association Charitable Trust, and talk about, perhaps, let's turn about the implications this has on the UK. Leroy, you were in the police force for 30 years. We're talking about how American policing is being perceived by communities in the United States. British policing, how does that compare to the US in regards to working with ethnic communities?
Well, I think the basis of the Metropolitan Police was a clear understanding that you've got to work in partnership with the community very closely. We are a Met Police service, whereas a lot of departments in the US and other parts of the world are a police force. So we serve by consent, and so we have the checks and balances, the accountability, the transparency, and more importantly, the external oversight. You know, even including the IPCC and various other organisations, to make sure that we're fit for purpose.
But how, when you see what's happened in Dallas and you see how police are now being targeted and seen in some ways as a source of vitriol, how does that make you feel?
Well, I feel really sad, you know, having been a police officer, and I know officers were protecting those people. And more, the real irony is Dallas is one of the most progressive police departments in the US. They are working closely with the community. They are actually bringing in external oversight. They got the performance data to show their conduct and how they are actually improving. So they're a lot more transparent, and you know, I suppose there are other departments where this could have happened, where you could think, well, actually, I'm not surprised, but Dallas is one of the most progressive ones, and it saddens me. But you know, the slain officers and the ones that were injured. I think anyone would sympathise with that, and you know, their hearts, they're in our hearts and minds, you know, for their loss and they're injured.
Ben, you're in Austin, in Texas, but obviously you have a good view of what's happening in Dallas. Is it a progressive police force? Does it feel progressive from what you're hearing?
Well, these things are all relative. So I'm sure, and as, you know, as your guest just pointed out, many of these police forces often have black officers, you know, leading them, chief officers. But I want to go back to this kind of question as to whether or not, you know, Black Lives Matter are unfairly politicised in these deaths. I actually think that race is a political matter, that racism is a political issue. And I think what they're trying to highlight is the systematic and systemic ways in which black people will continue to be disadvantaged in the US because of their blackness. That's a political issue. You know, if you just look at up until the Washington Post did a recent study, and they showed that around over 500 people have been killed by police officers up to this point alone. Last year, it was 990 people were killed. So it's likely to be over 1,000 people will be killed by police officers in the US. And a disproportionate number of those will be African Americans. So you have this kind of convergence of, like I said, the kind of militarization of the police force, the widespread use of guns and you know, rifles, assault weapons. And on top of that, you have the kind of political context in which people like Donald Trump have kind of invoked this sense of kind of white fear and white anxiety about losing our country. And so in this context, this is why I would say that we do have this almost like an undeclared low-grade civil war in the US right now, because both sides are kind of armoured up as if they are, you know, military forces.
And to pick up on your statistics, 1,152 people killed in the USA by police in 2015. 30% of those victims were black. 13% of the US population is black. So this is disproportionate, and there's no argument about that. Charlie, Ben was bringing up the whole politicalisation, using examples for Donald Trump, but President Obama has come under a lot of pressure
Very much.
for not, and I'm quoting from various articles, not being black enough, not addressing the racial tension in the United States, and perhaps it even worsening under his presidency.
It has worsened, unfortunately, and I think in some respects he hasn't been the sort of leader to the black community that he could have been. Here was a golden opportunity, someone that's made it to the White House that should be a major moment of pride, but it goes further than that. Unfortunately, instead of uniting the country, a lot of his statements have been disuniting. Taking, very mildly at least, but pot shots at the police, making statements that weren't necessarily true, putting in political statements over gun control. He was talking that in the last 2 statements over Dallas. That wasn't a gun control issue, or at least not at this point. We had police officers that it's important that these institutions are respected, and they need to earn that respect. And obviously when they go wrong, they need to be held to account. But I think the majority of the police force, from the statistics I've seen, really do care about their populations. And again, I go down to the fact that I think there are people, it's politics, and politics is about power, that are trying to tear down these institutions, which again hurts the black population in particular.
Douglas.
Can I just pick up on this thing about the politicisation thing? I'm not arguing, and I don't think anybody else is, that very serious social injustice shouldn't be politicised. Of course it should be. Of course it's a political issue. My point is that when it comes to specific cases, I mean, a specific incident of, an encounter between the police and a member of the public that ends in a gunfight, people have to be exceptionally careful about how fast and what they draw from it. I just think that it is worth everybody simmering it down a bit, not immediately assuming that, for instance, and claiming that the police shot this person only because they were black, or indeed that the gunman from Thursday night shot the policeman only because he's white, until you know what they're saying, why they might have done it, wait for the investigation, and so on. And that seems to me one of the key problems in America, the tinderbox feeling, to my mind. I'm in America quite a lot, I don't live there, but my thing is that it's that tinderbox feeling that you're only ever one incident away from people picking an incident up for their own purposes, running with it, and possibly running with something that's not true.
But can I just to say briefly that there's, so you're right, on the general issue of whenever there's a specific incident, should we wait to find out all of the details and the context, etc.? Yes, of course, I fully agree. But there's a pattern here. So, and it's also interesting the extent to which, for many white Americans, they simply can't see the patterns. So even when you show them this pattern and this statistic, so you have, look at the incarceration rates in America. You have over 2 million people incarcerated, the majority of whom are people of colour. Disproportionate to the population size, as you just mentioned. So once you have these patterns, it's not surprising that people can come to these issues and to make sense of it. So it's not so much, I think, the African-American community seeing politics where it doesn't exist. It's actually the white community and white society failing to see racism when it's in their face.
I just want to get a taste of how our viewers are seeing this conversation and hearing some of their texts and tweets. And Tommy, you've been collating those.
Yeah, Naga, there's different kind of angles. Some people highlighting the fact that racism within the police is an ongoing issue. Other people think that the overuse of guns in America is a serious problem which has to be addressed. And others saying that they're questioning the tone of the media coverage. But is America failing its black community? Rose says, I think the American police can be overly aggressive and far too quick to draw on a gun, so yes. Warren says no. More white people get shot than blacks in the USA. This is just being stirred up by the media. Elizabeth saying, get rid of the guns and investigate the endemic racism in the police force. Susie saying, it's failing all of its citizens, regardless of ethnicity and colour, that we're all being let down by the police. And Peter finally saying, no, this is not the issue. It says the inexcusable shootings in Dallas by a black gunman were deliberate and targeted on white officers. Why is this not labelled as racist by the media?
Thanks very much, Tommy. To bring the discussion back to the UK, Lola, and thinking about how we are different to the United States. Lots of people bringing up the fact that guns are an issue and more freely available there. Obviously, that's not the case here in the UK. Your thoughts on how we compare?
I mean, I think obviously the guns issue is a big one. I quite like the fact that here to carry a gun as a police officer you have to be highly skilled, highly trained and specialised. Actually, with America, I do wonder if perhaps the police shouldn't carry guns unless they are highly skilled and highly specialised in weapons training in that way. I do think that the UK has its own issues with race and in terms of criminal justice and the relationship between black communities and law enforcement.
But as we heard from Leroy, there are very public efforts of how that is being tackled.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's stuff happening. Is it enough? I don't know. I think more can always be done. But I don't think that the UK should be complacent at all.
Leroy, let's get a comment from you. Where do you draw the line, I suppose? We're talking about the use of guns between enforcing the law and just stepping over that, or perhaps letting emotion get in the way, because that is what the assumption is here on all these cases, of police killings of black people.
Well, I think we need to recognise that, you know, as a police service over here, we don't patrol generally with sidearms, and the ones that do are normally brought into that situation. So as a result of that, we developed certain communication skills, and our default position is not to reach for our gun, or as you see in America. And as a result of that, we're normally willing to defuse a situation or contain a situation, as opposed to reacting in a way that can inflame it, and sometimes people losing their lives or getting injured. So I think we're far from perfect. We've got a lot to do. I know certain officers have tasers, which are a non-lethal option. I'm concerned that if we arm our officers, we'll change the look and feel of our police service, which is the envy of the world, because a lot of people can't understand that we serve and we don't carry firearms. So I would like to make sure that we keep the look and feel of it, and to make sure that we address the disproportionalities that we have over here in terms of the DNA database, the tasers. Similarly, 80% black and minority ethnic are being on the receiving end of tasers, and so these sort of things we're going to make sure that we keep abreast of and accountable, so that people have that trust and confidence, and so they will work closely with police on the long term, and hopefully address the issues and don't get into the situation where it's them and us, and officers are seen as an occupying force.
OK. Leroy Logan, Chair of the Black Police Association Charitable Trust, thank you very much for your comments. Panellists, thank you very much as well. We have to move on. Thank you at home as well for your comments. Please do keep them coming in. Stay tuned and do get involved with our conversation.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.